the ADB has, on transparency and accountability. If you go to the ADB website, it gives a whole list of things that, it has an access to information policy, it has an accountability mechanism policy, it has, cooperation between ADB and NGOs, it has anti-corruption policies, it has safeguard policy statement and evaluation policy, and even more recently that how it translates, and you can have material in different languages. And it has also a problem solving kind of a pyramid where, apparently there is a project level grievance redress mechanism. And if you were carefully listening to Ram, the project level grievance redress mechanism, if you go to them, then you might actually get beaten. Then you have the operations department, which generally tries to push what the promoter is asking for. And then there is also the other, you can escalate it to a compliance review mechanism. But one of the things that I'm going to focus is on the safeguard policies. The safeguard policy is being revised now. So this might be an opportunity, and we at the NGO Forum on ADB are trying to see how we can push this at this point of time. So the safeguard policy, is expected, policy is expected for board review, right? Which will be, so that in the coming year there will be a new revised safeguard policy. What does the safeguard policy do? The safeguard policy is supposed to have the overarching objective to prevent, minimize, mitigate, or compensate for adverse project impacts. And also it, which is where the trick is that many of these are saying that they will have country systems, and the safeguard policy will strengthen the country systems. The review of the safeguard policy, the ADB says it'll go by two kind of processes. One is a brief analytical studies, and second is to briefly consider implementation experience. I think the importance is the word brief, because in both cases it's not wanting to elaborately understand, and some example which I'll tell you will reflect upon it. If you see the analytical studies, there are 19 such studies that it is it's planning to undertake, or some parts of it undertaken. Looks, when you look at this, it looks very comprehensive. But the trick, I think, is in this kind of a thing, not only of ADB, most multilateral development bodies, and even institutions like the UN. Similarly, I don't know how brief these studies would be. Similarly, if you look at what briefly consider implementation experience means, if you look at the lessons learned from compliance review, it says between 2004 and 2020 it has learnt about the Mundra project. One is adequate identification of project affected people in the first step, comprehensive assessment of baseline and its impact. The ADB's team must track project design and implementation, and it must see that all stakeholders in private sector projects understand operational policies. So these are something very basic that should have been done right at the inception. So you don't say that you spent 2 decades and say that this is what we have learned. So one of the overarching problems at many of these agencies is, if you find something very wrong with their process, then they say it is a lesson learned from them. But the learning of their lessons is so expensive for the people. It is at such a huge cost to the people that they don't seem to realize. It's a very bureaucratic process of saying, okay, we learned from that exercise, and we'll be better off in future. But if you recall what Meda said, this was learned, in the 80s itself. So you are learning from 80s, again 90s, and so essentially it means the multilateral development banks never learn. So what we are trying to do as civil society at this stage is to look at how do we get this the ADB to have a more robust and rights based and just safeguard policy, uh, how to improve the policy gaps, how lessons that project affected communities should be the prime consideration in shaping this protection social safeguard system. And more importantly, that what we have been emphasizing, and I think we all realize in almost all the projects, how this all safeguard can be front loaded, or how the quality of entry reports are are scrutinized, and are because there is no point in later saying that we did not take the people's concerns into account when we were actually financing the project. So how to include transparency clauses in loans and contract agreements, and how to enforce public disclosure and reporting requirements, how the risk of gender, climate, land acquisition should be made at the concept stage of the project, and the disclosure of information to stakeholders should be made within a time-bound manner. And how do you maintain, like for instance, in most cases, these multilateral banks say that it is a country policy or the country needed it. So how do we find the kind of equivalence between the country safeguard systems and the multilateral development bank, and how it has to be a binding requirement both for sovereign and non-sovereign lending. Non-sovereign lending is more now like corporations and private sector essentially, and how we can strengthen the guidance in case of involuntary settlements, resettlements. How even in case of uh, high GHG emitting. For instance, if we look at energy policy, they are talking about gas as a kind of a transition fuel. So how do we have a coherent, kind of a mechanism for it? And also, this kind of we particularly saw after the COVID, the safeguards that are required in the case of emergency assistance. For instance, in the case of COVID, India got loans which could and could show expenses even before anyone knew of COVID. For instance, the loan that was cleared in June 2020 said that the government can up to 40% of the loan could be for expenses even before anyone knew about COVID. So this kind of like leeway that is granted leads to a lot more intransparency in the whole process. So in the name of emergency, some of these things are kind of curtailed. So how due diligence, both in case of which they have been talking only in the case of so-called indigenous communities and not across all the communities, including tribal communities in India. How this free prior informed consent could be there, and how we can incorporate human rights and labor rights due diligence when projects are started. So this is a campaign that's an ongoing campaign. How do we push for a robust rights-based and just safeguards? You can look at the NGO Forum's website, and we have drawn out a petition, and we'll push this ahead. The when you look at not only ADB, but most other multilateral organizations, uh, for instance, how do you track? So, what we are finding is like the SDGs, you create a numerous kind of indicators, and which are incompatible in some case, and there is problem of aggregation. So as a result, you don't know anything. For instance, in the SDG, it says that no one is left behind. If no one is left behind, then if that is the primary focus of the 2030 agenda, then if you put that on the top, you will find that eliminating poverty, creating an equitable kind of economic environment is the only kind of indicator that you need. But then you create a complex web of indicators that you can always show progress, or you can say incremental progress is happening, while we are sometimes finding ourselves in a situation which is worse than where we started. The other kind of concern is that there is a multilateral development bank harmonization, and one would think that this will improve quality, but this is only uh, going to the bottom. This is the least common multiples. Like if and these days, like joint lending, co-financing, these kind of terminologies, and one doesn't know who is the right person to go and raise your concerns, because the ADB has a small fund, the AIB has a fund, the World Bank is funded a little, and a classic case in the Kundalia project is in the Madhya Pradesh irrigation project, where they said that the reservoir is funded by the state government, and therefore the submergence is not the problem of the ADB. They have been only supporting the right bank and the left bank canal, and that right bank canal is also completely handed over to Larsen and Toubro, from the construction of the right bank canal to ultimate last drop of irrigation, and in this way surrogately completely privatizing the irrigation process in the state. So this kind of a harmonization, co-financing is another big concern that needs to be watched out. There are other issues, like the energy policy, that is something very, crucial in the whole debate of transition. What we find, not only with ADB, with most of the multilateral banks, they are pushing for gas as a transition fuel. And even though we already have standard gas assets in our country, and very strangely, one of our Reliance projects, they opened up the plant and sold it to Bangladesh with some JICA assistance. Similarly, the funding, in the name of renewables, is large-scale renewables. There is very little thinking on or finance on distributed energy. Then the other kind of issue is of financial intermediaries. Currently, a lot of funding goes through what we call as financial intermediaries. Like in India, we have the National Infrastructure and Investment Fund, or there is regional funds like this, which have very little oversight. Then there is whole issue of public sector engagement, the scale, which has the scale and ability to distort. And similarly, the new elephant in the room is the what is called the ESG investments, or uh, environment, social, and governance, issue based investments. One of the things that I wanted to share with you is the Coalition on Rights in Development uh, has developed this early warning system, so that like as Meda pointed out, how do we track things when in the beginning, if the entry, do we want the project or not? That is the question, rather than later seeking compensation or remedies for it. So this is kind of an early warning system. It's still in the development, but if there are more people who are kind of looking it into it, and if we are able to learn from our past kind of experiences, how we can look at and forewarn people that some projects are coming, I think that will be a useful thing. But if you look at the problem solving function or the compliance, the like any good bureaucracy, you will find that whatever complaint is registered, they would first say that they have reviewed, acknowledged, and they will say that the actually your complaint is not eligible, uh, but we are having a look at it. So, in order to put the complainant in a back foot, this is a kind of strategy that they have been deploying. And in most of the cases, they will cite some reason that the original letter did not come from the actually impacted community, or there was not a letter saying that you are authorized to represent them, or they would say that you should have complained 6 months prior. So these are the kind of flimsy reasons they usually know. I was telling you about this ESG investments. So the moment something is ESG, it is already thought that it is a green investment, and therefore, the Indian government has also now, in its relentless effort to dilute all the environmental and other laws and regulations, where it says white industries do not need environmental impact assessment. The good may be white. Your biscuit factory may be biscuit may be a white good, but the process of making biscuit can have environmental harms is not understood, or is kind of ignored. And similarly, whenever there is a ESG based investment, people think it is already green. So this is going to be the new kind of a weapon. And already they are, the landscape, they say that there are going to be about 11 billion in the last decade, which could be classified as ESG investment. And there is an increasing appetite for ESG integrated assets. That's what the ADB itself is trying to push, and say that performance of ESG integrated investment is better than their counterpart, and they could even make profit during the pandemic. So, but the bottom line is the companies performed better in policy disclosures and on parameters, environmental and social factors. Of all factors, social factors receive the lowest priority. So I'll stop at that, saying that social aspects receive the lowest priority in any of these investments by banks and lending by banks, and it is only vigilant civil society that can possibly stem this kind of damage. Thank you very much.